What a journey that we have been on. This is the 7th week of our Emotionally Healthy Spirituality series. Next week, Blake is going to be sharing the final message of this campaign. But what an incredible journey this has been for us as a church. We've explored many topics and issues and ideas over this series, and I don't know, but if you're like me, it's kind of felt like you're trying to drink from a fire hose. There's just been so much there and you're trying to get it all down because there's a lot in this series. And I would encourage you, if you have missed any of the sermons in this series, go to our YouTube channel, catch up, watch the ones that you have missed. But I'd also encourage you, just because of how much there is in this series as a whole, even if you've seen all of the messages, even if you've heard all of the messages, go back and re-watch some of them. This is my second or third time going through all of this material, and it has been just awesome to be able to stop and look and go, well, I used to be over here. This is where I used to be, where with my emotions, this is how I used to deal with things. But now I'm here. Now I'm still not here where I want to be, but I've made progress. I'm not the same person that I was before because I've been able to put some of this stuff into practice, but I know there's still more I need to learn. So go re-watch some of these messages, re-watch some of these sermons, and continue to implement them and put them into practice. See, today's topic that I want to share with you is growing into an emotionally mature adult. And over this whole series, we've been exploring the idea that we can unleash a spiritual revolution inside our lives when we combine the thread of contemplative spirituality and emotional health. And last week, Blake looked at two ancient spiritual practices that help to develop that contemplative spirituality within us. The idea of the daily office and the rhythm of Sabbath. But some of us need to be careful, and I'd probably include myself in this. Some of us are drawn to those more contemplative practices, and we forget what God wants to do through our emotional health, through our emotional lives. Or maybe you're somebody who is more drawn to that emotional side and you forget about the contemplative side. Because the whole idea of this series and the whole idea of what I want to talk about today is that these two threads can't be separated. We need to have them together and connected, not disconnected in our spirituality. And today, as we look at this idea, we're going to be looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke chapter 10. And Jesus tells this parable after a discussion with a teacher of the law. They had summarized all of the law and the prophets into 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. But the teacher of the law then asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Let's read it now from verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. This whole parable is based around the way that the expert in the law summarized what the law says. There are 2 commands and everything else hangs off them. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love other people. This is contemplative spirituality and emotional maturity. And quite simply, emotional maturity is learning how we're going to love well. Because the key point that Jesus wants to bring out of this parable is he wants to demonstrate how easy it is for us to have a disconnected spiritual life. We find it so easy in life to love God, but it's hard to love people because loving people is messy. Loving people is difficult. Loving people is painful at times. We get hurt when we love other people. But God, that's easy. And so we want to do that, but we have to get this right, that loving God and loving people. Because emotional maturity is the thing that moves us from hypocrisy to genuine love. Today's whole topic is about making sure that we are not living spiritual lives that are hypocritical, that are full of pretense, but instead we need to live out what we believe. And emotional maturity is about walking out what we know is true. And in the parable that Jesus told, there were two examples of people who knew about God. The priest and the Levite. They both knew and they taught a lot about God. And yet they missed the whole love other people part of the law. They were both into God and not into people. And because of this, the faith that they lived out was hypocritical. And we know what it's like when we deal with somebody who's a hypocrite, who says one thing but then does another. And I don't know if you're like me, but when you see that in other people, it's kind of frustrating and it grinds your gears a little bit. But what's worse is when somebody actually uses that against you. And for me, that cuts deep. Because I've spent so much of my life going, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to have these different personalities or these different masks that I wear in different places. I want to be the same person wherever I go. Now, that's an easier goal to set than to actually achieve. But can you think of the times that you've seen people who are hypocritical in their faith and the way that it turns people off Jesus? Because when we talk about emotional maturity, we're talking about living this out, not just when you're on your best behavior. This is not just about when you start that new job and you're trying to keep everything inside so that you don't freak other people out. Or when you have a new relationship and you're trying to hide all of your bad habits and try and hide all of your craziness. Now, emotional maturity is about what happens behind closed doors. It's about when the cameras are off, when you don't have to hide it all anymore, when there's no one else watching. This is about how you go as a parent or as a husband or wife when the rest of your church family isn't there to see it. Because I'm sure that if the priest or the Levite had some members of their congregation with them as they went, if they had had others with them who could see their actions, I think that this story would have had a different outcome. Emotional maturity is loving well when nobody else can see. Because if we just do it when other people are around, that's not loving well. And Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 13, without love, our actions are useless. But with love, we can have a powerful and a genuine faith. But we need to develop this emotional maturity. And within the church, there are these two myths that probably stop us from being able to develop this easily. And the first myth is this, that when you become a Christian, you will just naturally grow into an emotionally mature adult. It will just happen. It's something that will just happen. The same as you grow from a child into an adult, you'll just emotionally grow from a child into an adult. And we look at verses like 2 Corinthians 5, verse 17, which says that we are a new creation in Christ. The old has gone and the new has come. And we apply that to every part of our lives. We think that as soon as we become a Christian, our emotional lives are exactly as they need to be. But in reality, that verse is speaking about how we appear before God. It speaks about how when we become a Christian, when we accept Christ's sacrifice, God sees us standing before him and we have the righteousness of Christ. We have the righteousness of Jesus. We are completely forgiven and loved by Jesus. We're set free of the sin that binds us, but we need to actually learn, how do we walk in this? What do we do? How do we actually live in this new way? We have to learn how to do these things. We don't automatically grow to maturity. That's why we need discipleship. So that's the first myth. But the second myth is this, that those within the church are able to just naturally love better than those outside the church. That because we have Jesus, we are just naturally better at loving. And I so wish that this were true, but unfortunately, it's not. According to many studies, the rates of divorce, of family violence, of sexual immorality, they're not overly different compared when you compare people within the church and those outside of the church. In fact, if I stop and I think about the person who has taught me the most about how to love other people and people different from myself, I didn't meet them in the church. I met them outside of the church. They were someone who, sadly, they didn't want anything to do with God, and yet they were just so loving. Now, as the church, we should be better at loving. There should be a qualitative difference in our love for others. But in reality, there's not. And the reason for that goes back to the first myth. We don't naturally learn to be emotionally mature. It's an intentional discipleship process. And many of us in churches, we haven't had an example from those around us to be able to grow the way we need to. If we want to be a spiritually mature and emotionally mature Christian, we need to learn, what does it mean to love well? And this is a process. We might physically grow through the stages of infant, child, adolescent, and adult. We do the same for our emotional maturity. It just doesn't happen naturally. And it also doesn't relate to our physical age. You can be 20 or 40 or 80 years old, and you can still be an emotional infant. Now, on the screen, there are going to be 4 stages, along with a short description of each of them. Now, emotional infants, they are like a baby. They rely on others for everything. They demand other people meet their needs and their wants. People are objects to them, just there to fulfill their needs. An adult who is acting like an emotional child, they're going to take disagreements as a personal attack. They're going to act out their resentments. They're going to be easily hurt because everything is taken personally. When things go their way, they're fine, but as soon as things don't, they're going to arc up. An emotional teenager, well, they're starting to learn how to interact well. They're starting to learn how to communicate well, but they see things as transactional. If I do this for you, then that means that you're going to owe me down the track. And they keep score. They want to cash that in later on. But an emotional adult, and this is the aim for all of us, they are able to be respectfully assertive of their needs. They can listen with empathy. They can see other people's points of view. Now, on your weekly updates this week, there is a link to an online assessment, and it will help you to learn which category that you fit into. But I wonder, as I've spoken about those, is there one category that kind of stands out to you a little bit more than the others? Can you kind of already identify which one you might fit into? And if you saw yourself in one of those and it's not the emotional adult, that's okay. That probably means that you're being honest about this, because that's also part of learning to grow into this, is what it's all about. It is learning in discipleship. How do I move through these stages at home, at work, in my relationships, and at school? And the parable of the Good Samaritan that we're looking at today, well, this demonstrates these categories. See, we see in verses 31 and 32, the priest and the Levite. These guys knew their Bibles. They had memorized the first 5 books. They knew God's laws back to front. They preached about love. They preached about caring to others. They knew what God was all about. And yet, as they walk along by the road, they see the guy on the side of the road and their hearts aren't moved. There is nothing. There is just deadness. They don't stop to check it out. Their spirituality is disconnected. They've got loving God and loving others in these 2 separate camps. Never shall they meet. Now, Jesus doesn't actually give us a reason for why they passed by. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they had somewhere to be. Maybe they didn't want to become unclean by going near a dead body. Maybe they were overwhelmed by the need that they saw. This guy was beaten. He was broken. They probably thought he was already dead. And so they were just unsure what could they actually do, so they moved on. And Jesus doesn't tell us why, and honestly, the why doesn't matter. Because we will always find excuses. We will always have a reason why we can't stop. There's always a reason and an excuse why when you're driving on the highway, you can't stop to see what the person on the side of the road needs. But then we reach verse 33, and we see a Samaritan come by, and he takes pity on the man. And that word, take pity, it's that Greek word that we've seen before as a church. Let's see if I can get it right. Splanchnosomai. It is that bowel-shaking, gut-wrenching feeling of compassion that Jesus had when he saw the crowds. It is the compassion and the pity that he had when he saw the widow at Nain. This is a compassion that doesn't just move people to act, it compels people to act. And the shock of this parable is that it was the Samaritan who takes pity. Because to the Jews, the Samaritans were just all wrong. They were a different race, religion, and political view. In fact, the Talmud, which is like a commentary for the Jewish rabbis, actually says, "He who eats bread with Samaritans is like one who eats the flesh of pigs." Now, to the Jews, that's an insult. To us, it's somebody who loves bacon. But for the Jews, it shows the depth of their hatred. Jesus makes this guy the hero above the religious leaders. So who would that be in your world? Who is the person that you think has no hope of being right with God? Because that's the person that Jesus has put into this parable to sum up so many of the commandments in the Bible. Because the Samaritan has the same kind of compassion that Jesus does. He's filled with compassion and he does something about it. This is an emotional adult, and despite the animosity between their people, the Samaritan doesn't see the man as an object. He doesn't see the man as just something. He sees him as a person. I want to ask you a question. When you hear this parable, who are you in it? Are you the priest? Are you the Levite? Are you the Good Samaritan? Because I think most of us, when we read this story, we acknowledge that we fall short of being the Good Samaritan, but that's where we want to see ourselves in this story. But in actual fact, when we look at this parable, we are the man who is lying in the gutter. We are the one in need of help, and Jesus is the Good Samaritan. He is the one who has come to not just bind our wounds, but he has come to make us whole, to save us from death. He did that on the cross. But so often we look at these Bible stories and we say, I want to be David slaying Goliath. I want to be Moses speaking boldly to Pharaoh. I want to be the Good Samaritan who comes and saves this man. But that is Jesus' role. But we want to be that person. And that actually teaches us something important, because if you want to become emotionally mature, you need to realize you are not the center of the universe. And I mean this in the nicest possible way, but actually the world does not revolve around you. I mean, it's easy to believe that it does. We're only able to see the world around us and experience it through our own eyes. We can only view the world through our own thoughts. And one of the aspects of becoming emotionally mature is we need to actually realize we're not the most important person in the room. So often people view others as objects and not people. Now, we may not think about it like that in our heads, but when we see other people just in terms of what they can do for us, or in moving them around to gain what we need, when we see them in terms of a transaction, we see them as objects. Maybe you say, I'm going to swap you this spot on the roster for that spot on the roster. And that's the only conversation you have, other than maybe a little bit of small talk so it's not rude when you ask them for a favor. Or maybe when I just come along and I just tell you to do something without actually caring for who you are as a person. That is treating other people as objects. That's what the priest and the Levite were doing. See, they looked at the man broken by the side of the road, and in the transaction in their heads, they said, I see trouble and not enough gain. In a profit loss statement in their heads, they say, I'm not going to get anything out of this. They wouldn't get back even what they put in, and so they move on. But the Samaritan, on the other hand, he saw this man as a person. This is someone who is made in the image of God, just like I am. This is someone who has value, just like I have value. This is someone who has hopes and dreams and beliefs. They are different to mine, but I have hopes, dreams, and beliefs. This is someone who is important, just like I am important. See, this is a Copernican revolution. Copernicus was a scientist who made the theory that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, that everything doesn't just revolve around the Earth, but instead the Earth revolves around the sun along with the other planets. We need to realize everyone and everything does not revolve around us. Instead, all individuals are revolving around God, whether they know it or not, and whether they like it or not. But we are all distinct. We are all equal. We all have value because we are all made in the image of God. And so part of being emotionally mature means we have to take ourselves out of the center of the universe. But we don't just put another person back in that spot. God goes in that spot. Now I wonder, if God came and answered all of your prayers, great or small, from the last week, would the whole world change? Or would just your world change? It's a challenging question, isn't it? But if we want to be emotionally mature, this is an important step to take. We need to take ourselves out of the center and see ourselves with other people. We need to realize the sacredness of others. A child can't see this. They can't understand it, but an adult can and should see it. This is what it means to love your neighbor as ourselves, to love them as a unique, sacred, valuable person made in the image of God, just as you are. And please hear that. We treat others as we are. And I know that for many people, it is easy to see other people as valuable, but you forget about yourself. But part of this commandment is we're called to love and respect ourselves as well. And that's what we see in verses 34 to 37. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So often we can operate on a pendulum. We either focus on ourselves and forget other people, or we can focus on others and we forget ourselves. But that's not how the Good Samaritan operated. He had mercy in a healthy way, and he teaches us that emotional maturity means boundaries. The Good Samaritan had boundaries. He's filled with that gut-wrenching compassion, but he tempers it with healthy boundaries, with protection for himself as well. It's easy for us to focus so much on other people that we forget to look after ourselves. But here the man stops. He bandages the man's wounds. He takes time. He spends his personal resources looking after the man because he knows this guy matters. This guy is valuable. He puts the man on his own donkey. He continues his own journey. He goes the way that he was already going. He takes him to an inn, and then the next day he pays the innkeeper to keep looking after him. He continues with his own life. He doesn't stay with him till he's fully healed. He doesn't put his entire life on hold until this guy is completely better. But nor does he just abandon him. Instead, he loves with a healthy mercy filled with boundaries. We are called to love other people. That's emotional maturity. But we are allowed and we are meant to have boundaries when we do that. Now, what your boundaries are, I can't say. That's a topic for a whole nother sermon. But it is okay to tell somebody who wants you to listen to them that you can't listen at the moment, but you can direct them to other people who can help. It is okay to tell people around you you're not wanting to spend time with others because you need time by yourself to recharge your batteries. It is okay not to stop and give the person by the side of the road a lift in your car because you've got your kids or your family in the car. But you can also stop and see if they need help calling someone. We are still able to love well when we have boundaries, because they are an important part of loving well. Now, the Good Samaritan didn't disrupt everything for every need, but he did take time out of his life to do out of what he was doing to love well, up to his boundaries, up to his limits. We are called to do the same. Now, as I finish up today, I have two final tips to help us as we grow into emotional adults. The first one is this: know where you're coming from. If we want to become emotionally mature, we need to actually learn where we're starting from. We need to learn emotional maturity, and often we learn it from our families of origin, but our families will often invest in our education. They might invest in our career opportunities, but they don't intentionally invest in our emotional maturity and development. And I think that this is starting to change a little bit. There is an awareness that is starting to grow. But if we want to become emotionally mature, we need to know where we are starting from. And this means when we look at those categories of infant and child and adolescent and adult, it means we need to be honest about which category we fit into. We need to acknowledge the truth of the matter, no matter how hard that might be. Now, you might have looked at those categories before and recognized you're an emotional child. Well, good. Now, you might be going, but there's still a long way to go between child and adult, and you're absolutely right. But when you can truthfully acknowledge where you're starting from, you can start to acknowledge what you need to learn and where you need to grow so you can move forward. You can start to acknowledge the emotional skills that you have learnt, both good and bad, and you can make a plan to move forward. Now, this isn't to place blame on our families of origin. This isn't to place blame on those around us. It is for understanding. Because when we don't actually learn those skills that we need from our families, we then carry our lack of skills into our families moving forward. We begin teaching our kids from our skills and our lack of skills as well. It becomes a dangerous cycle. And I made the comment in the office today or this week to Simona that I've never felt so personally attacked by a sermon that I've preached as I do when I think about this. Because as I think about the kind of parent that I am, I go, gee, there's a long way that I've still got to go. Just take the time to know where you're coming from. Do that assessment on the link in the weekly update. Take the time to sit in silence before God and to journal. Ask Him, where am I? And what do I need so you can move forward? And the second thing is, know that growth takes time and effort. Even though we love Jesus, even though we are made new by Him, that doesn't change the fact that we have to learn how to become emotionally mature. The point of the Good Samaritan parable is you can't separate loving God and loving people. So if you want to be emotionally mature and love other people, you need to take steps to make it happen. You need to identify the gaps between where you are and where you need to be, and then you have to start practicing them. You have to start implementing them. You have to start making choices today to start walking in that. We don't do it alone. We do it with God's help. At the end of the Good Samaritan's parable, Jesus says, go and do likewise. Well, we can only do that because we know that He is the Good Samaritan who has shown us mercy. He's shown it to us. He's demonstrated it to us. So now we can show others. We need the love of God. We need the working of the Holy Spirit to implement these things, but we also have to be willing to take the steps to grow. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen as soon as we make the decision. It takes time. This is a marathon and not a sprint. But I'd encourage you, stop and look back regularly. At the start of today, I mentioned that I've been able to look back and realize that, I used to be over there with the way I dealt with my emotions, with the way I dealt with things. But I'm not there anymore. I'm still not where I want to be all the way over here, but I've made progress. It's taken time, it's taken effort. I've had to implement things, but I'm growing. Stop and look at the progress you're making. Because God's heart is that our spirituality is connected, not disconnected. That loving God and loving people are inseparable parts of following Him. God wants us as followers of Him to be emotionally mature, to be able to love well in all that that means. And He has shown us how to do that. And He continues to show us that. So let's learn from His example.